Does the NBN really have a clean bill of health?
And has Vodafone cracked the mobile roaming conundrum? Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, is proudly brought to you by Belkin. Welcome to Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, where we talk to Australia's leading technology journalist to get the stories behind the news of the week. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm joined by a man who will probably just talk Doctor Who with his brother Angus for the next half hour if we don't keep him on track.
Ba-ding,
Alex
ba-ding,
Kidman.
ba-ding, ba-ding.
As we go behind the headlines in search of the big picture. Also joining us is said brother. Yes, we've smashed the glass to grab the emergency Vertical Hold guest again this week. Finder.com.au editor-in-chief Angus Kidman. Angus, welcome back to the show.
I'm pleased to brush the glass off and say, ba-ting!
This week we're diving into the latest NBN reports as well as examining Vodafone's latest roaming deals. But first, over to the news desk. Alex, what's new in tech?
We could be about to see a shake-up in the 4G and 5G modem worlds, with a US federal judge ruling that Qualcomm must license some of its patents to rival Intel. The move could have significance given Qualcomm's general speed lead in the mobile modem space, and especially as Apple has shifted over to using slower Intel modems in its current generation of iPhone devices.
Believe it or not, Australia actually has the cheapest broadband in Oceania, according to a survey by Britain's cable.co.uk. We still managed to finish 84th in the ranking of 195 countries, though. If you're looking for the cheapest broadband deal, head over to the Ukraine, where you'll only pay $5 a month. Spare a thought, though, for people in Mauritania who pay $768 and only get 0.7 megabits per second.
Samsung is set this week to announce details around its first foldable phone handset, tentatively known as the Galaxy X, or, given it's 2018, possibly the Galaxy 10. It's not the first to market. That credit will technically go to the oddly named and seemingly not that well-built Royole FlexPi out of China. But Samsung has said ahead of the reveal, while we're recording, that a foldable phone is a completely new concept in terms of design and user experience, which requires a different approach.
The recent Telstra mobile outage caused havoc across the country, knocking out ATMs, cab charge services, and the FPOS facilities for many small businesses. But the situation was a bit more dire in South Australia, where the outage left the Department of Correctional Services unable to track 774 offenders. All but one of them was accounted for, and at least we know he couldn't have got far unless he was carrying cash. So, Alex, the foldable phone, it's been like the fountain of youth for phones. It's something they've talked about, this mystical thing that has never quite come about. Are we actually there, and does it look like it's going to be any good?
Well, there've been attempts, and, we had Bendgate, which was sort of like a foldable phone, but it broke when you tried to fold it.
The inadvertent foldable phone.
And, older phone users, of course, might remember flip phones and things like that, which were technically foldable phones. And ZTE had an Axon model, in fact, last year, which was a foldable phone, and it was dreadful. And the one that's coming out in China that I mentioned in our news piece, the Royole FlexPi, because that's a name that just rolls off the tongue.
Royale with cheese.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems to have an awful lot of cheese. All the reports I've read on it just say, yeah, this is not a good implementation of the idea. But it does seem as though this is all gathering speed. We are recording ahead of Samsung actually making its announcements around foldable phones, although it's not expected that they're going to say, and here it is, and you can buy it this week. Most of the smart money says that they will launch it properly next year, probably around CES. They might even hold off to a Mobile World Congress, but they seem to have a bit more. Well, they've certainly obviously got a bit more technology behind OLED, because most of the OLED displays you find in mobiles are Samsung panels, including those found in Apple phones. And the foldable thing comes from having an OLED itself that can fold. So you're not so much thinking of a hinge as you might the spine of a book, if that if that makes sense in a spoken medium. And most of them, Huawei are also said to be working on a similar concept. And I chatted to them very, very briefly when I was over for the Mate 20 launch. And those who haven't listened to that episode should go into the back catalogue and do so right now. Doesn't feature this detail, though, which was that they were looking at different form factors and what made sense and whether or not you wanted a foldable phone, which kind of became a sub-tablet when it was fully open, and then a phone by itself, or were you front and back? There's quite a lot of options on ways that you could do this. Gus, you're a guy who likes a larger phone, certainly. Would a foldable phone kind of entice you? Can you see a concept that would make sense?
I think the thing that's sexy about foldable phones and that we forget as we sit here going, well, this is weird because it's dual SIM and so it's two phones in one there, which is what the Royale with cheese was coming up with. What's good about foldable phones is it's a less smashable screen. If it's able to be bounced around, it's less likely to break when you drop it. So as a traveller, that makes me excited, even if I don't fold it terribly often.
Doesn't that presume that you're folding the internals of it? Because if the entire screen is around, you've got this. You might have the same problem we've got now with wireless charging phones, which are they're glass front, glass back. So it sort of doesn't matter which way you drop it. Something's getting smashed.
But the flexibility still means it doesn't smash in the same way. By definition, if your material can bend, if it can move around in that direction, you're going to be less susceptible. I can break technology with the best of them. And if there's going to be a way to
most.
Yeah. But I think that's actually one of the interesting things. Like, yeah, I don't mind the idea of something that's this big and then I can fold it out. Reality is I can do most things on the current large size of phone. But I think that moving to a new material might be more significant than we think, and how we do it or what we call it might be less important than we think of right now.
But think back in the day about when we used to first talk about folding phones, and also back when we had phones that had moving parts. It was always a recipe for disaster. Any phone that had a hinge or a keyboard that folded out or a thing that flipped like Kirk's tricord or whatever would break. Without fail, they were just badly
I never
designed.
managed to break my slide-out BlackBerry keyboard, which was a moving part that I used constantly. So I don't know.
The other thing there that I think is potentially interesting is we're seeing this huge rise in the cost of premium handsets. I mean, Apple's really kicked a long goal there, but Samsung's not that far behind. Even the new Huawei phone is a bit more expensive. Razer's got their new phone coming out, and that's looking to be in the same kind of price park. Now, I find it, I'm a guy who loves a premium phone, but I find it hard to justify when I'm writing a review saying, yeah, you should spend $2,000 on a phone. That seems ludicrous. A foldable phone, though, something that is tablet and phone in one, that can invite those kind of newer, larger screen experiences when you need them and then smaller screen when you don't. Yeah, I could see some justification at those price points. So I think the pricing, how they say this is worth so much money is going to be really interesting to see, because I would hope that there's a ceiling to smartphone pricing that they're not going to try and punch through just because it's the new thing.
So, Alex, last year when the NBN was going to hell, we said one of the things that we were really looking forward to was this independent speed testing that was hopefully going to keep the bastards honest. Now, the ACCC's come out with another one of their speed tests recently. Are we seeing an improvement? Are things getting better?
Well, according to the ACCC's third Measuring Broadband Australia report, broadly, yes, we are, with some caveats. So their speed monitoring report found that in August, that most NBN users hit between 84 to 89% of their peak speeds, and that was irrespective of their NBN speed tier. So if you're on a 12 meg plan, you were getting about 85 to 90% of that 12 meg. If you were on a 100 meg plan, you were getting about 85 to 90 meg, because the maths is really easy there. So the majority of people seem to be doing better, and this seems to come down to the way that they're now buying CVC. The CEO of Aussie Broadband actually chatted with Corinne Reichert from ZDNet, who we've had on the show before, and said, and basically said, oh, look, all the other ISPs were caught with their pants down around CVC, and everyone's had to catch up. And this result shows that was his perspective, that a lot of consumers are doing better in the main.
Yeah. But when you say 85 to 90% of peak speeds, they're not being promised 100 meg anyway. If you're on 100 meg, they're not allowed to advertise as a 100 meg plan anymore, are they? They have to say, peak hour speeds of whatever. So once you allow for that, they are kind of getting what they were promised, yes?
They're getting most of what they were likely to be promised. And it's true, most of not everyone participates in the speed report. That's a big limit to it. But most of the brands that do declare a peak evening speed, and that makes it possible to calculate that.
Yeah. And look, one of the other interesting stats with this is that 84 to 89%, that's a total average of all the stuff that they did. but they did break out separate figures for those peak evening periods, and they weren't hugely different. They were a little lower, but typically only by about a percentage point. One of the catches here, though, is that is across the big players, and we know from NBN co-zone figures that those big players actually do command most of the market. So you're talking TPG, who got a lot of really good press out of it because they were the ones on 89, basically. And I think at an end user level, the difference between 84 and 89 is not going to be all that noticeable, to be realistic. Yeah. But you had TPG, you had Telstra, you had Optus, you had My Republic, iiNet got in there, which is obviously a TPG sub-brand as well. So there's still a number of players in there who are not part of this test or who were not tested at this time. And the ACCC themselves kind of said, look, yeah, we know NBN Co has said that their congestion has actually gone up slightly for evenings. We think that the reason our figures are different to theirs is because they're including a lot of the smaller NBN players and we don't have data for them. We'd love consumers to sign up to be part of this speed testing trial.
Mm. And it's a concern for the ACCC because consumers are just like, I want to sign up with someone who's going to give me the NBN and it's not going to be rubbish. But the ACCC also say, that, yeah, the NBN was supposed to be the great white hope that would bring us this diversity of players and you could sign up with all sorts of people. What's happened? The same big three brands that existed before we have the NBN are the ones we're still buying stuff from. And if you don't, you're tending to get punished. And so as a competitive outcome, as an outcome of a policy, it still doesn't look that good.
And one of the other things that's driving that consolidation to the big players as well is this idea of 4G fallback that was spoken about before. And Telstra's now gone a step further with their broadband modems. If you're on the NBN and the NBN connection drops out, not only do you fail over to 4G for broadband, but you also fail over to 4G for voice. So now Telstra has failover for voice and broadband. So when I say voice, I mean
wouldn't
your home
have helped
phone.
you much last weekend, would it?
No. But so Telstra has failover for voice, home phone, and broadband. Vodafone has failover for broadband. Optus is the big one that hasn't got into this yet, and I think the pressure would be on them now. And then you've got TPG's, I guess, in with Vodafone, but that gives those three a bit of a marketing advantage when trying to sell to little old ladies who are worried about their home phone dropping out. And independent players can't really compete with that because if Aussie Broadband will say wants to offer that, they've got to go one of the big three and say, please, sir, can I have some mobile data? And there's no way in hell they're going to do them a great deal because this is their competitive advantage.
Yeah, but at the same time, an Aussie Broadband, Aussie actually built themselves up as a pretty solid brand on the back of providing fairly decent speeds and of doing things like, I honestly, off the top of my head, I don't know if they still offer this, but I know they had a 200 meg product in areas where they had a point of interest, point of interconnect, that could manage that. So they're playing to the rich end of town, which frankly, you know, where you and I and Gus would want to play of a high speed connection. They're playing to those people who are going to want that kind of service. I think they'll do okay. Although one of the other interesting stats that did come out, and whilst this was off a fairly small number of actual tests, if you're a sub wholesaler, that is, if you're an NBN ISP, but you're actually getting your NBN point of interconnect from someone else, so you're buying it largely from Vodafone or Optus, I believe. I don't think Telstra does a bunch of this.
No, but then there's the number 4 player in that list whose name escapes, and he basically just exists as a wholesaler, and all the brands buy through them. So definitely it's a segment.
If you're one of those, on average, you're about 8% slower than those who actually have a direct feed to the NBN, which is another kind of structural disadvantage, although presumably you wholesale like that because it's cheaper for you to do so. So a player like Kogan, for example, is a Vodafone wholesale customer. And not unsurprisingly, because they're a cut price player, that's the market they play in, and people understand that. That they've gone for a cheaper alternative there. So there might be a bit of an element of a you get what you pay for there as well.
So some people are not getting anywhere near what they pay for. Is it 7% of people are getting less than 50% of the maximum? Why have we still got so many people getting screwed so badly?
Have you seen the way that this network is being built? We may have discussed this on the show once or twice before.
As I asked the question, I thought, you know what? I think I know the answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of a cut rate operation is this?
Yeah. Look, I think 7% is not surprising. I guess what's concerning there, and what we don't know, is whether or not that 7% are being told this, because the ISPs are meant to be a bit more upfront with people when they order services, and especially over those, especially over fibre to the node, where that variability of copper plays a huge role, we know, in the quality of the connection you'll get. The ISPs are meant to advise people, and a lot of them are meant to give them exit clauses to say, hey, if you can't, if you've signed up for 50 and we work out that, sorry, the cockatoos have been chewing on the copper too much and part of the copper inside your house is in fact a now dead snake, that you could only get 12.
That's the most mixed animal metaphor I've ever.
Very Australian, though. Very Australian.
Oh, look! I remain confident that somewhere in the NBN there's a dead snake forming part of that.
I'm more confident of that than that a cockatoo got into your walls.
I was more thinking that the street-based copper than anything else.
Typically, that's actually going to be your HFC in a lot of cases when you're able to string it up in your local. Down the street from me, there are like every year you see cockatoos sort of doing exercise and then occasionally electrocuting themselves. Great fun. We're really getting off topic here.
But having said that, if these people are not being told that they can't get their advertised speed, they should be being shifted down or let out of their contract. And I believe the ACCC has actually rumbled about this kind of thing before. They've made noises towards the ISPs. And again, it's the bigger players that I know have this kind of thing. They'll do the whole kind of 30-day, you can get out of your contract, whatever, that's all fine thing, because people do hit these kinds of problems. And it also gets into the stuff. And again, we've talked about this at length. So if you're coming to this for the first time, go into the back catalogue. We have lots and lots of stuff on the NBN for you, that you get your service class 0 people, you get your people who just were on horrible copper to begin with, or who were in a very bad situation for getting that connection done, or where the dodgy subcontractor came and ran the cable under their gravel driveway,
filtered it through a dead dingo.
Remember? Yeah, exactly. Then that's where we're just hitting all the Australian animals this week. It's great. It's the national.
You reminded me that one of the second ISP I ever signed up with was the much lamented Dingo Blue.
Well, there we go.
Now we're going back.
Depths of time.
Were you wearing an onion? Were you wearing an onion on your belt at the time?
That was the style.
But I would imagine you would have been getting much, much slower speeds at that time. The thing
I don't know. You've been to my house. You know what the copper's like.
Well, this is sadly true. I think the takeaway from all of this, though, is that the work that's being done especially on basically kicking the ISPs until they buy enough CVC to meet the expectations of their customers seems to be bearing fruit. There's a bit of a long-term story here, though, about whether or not they will maintain that and what NBN Co is going to do around the pricing of all of that. Because, again, as we've discussed before, there are financial constraints on them to generate revenue, basically. And the balance between those is tricky, but it seems to be tilting largely towards the customers, unless you're very unlucky. And if you're very unlucky, then, bad luck.
Gus, they were talking about they're offering a discount on CVC, I think, that lets the telcos offer 50 meg plans at 25 meg prices or something like that. And that deal's going to run out, but then they're going to bring in some other deal. Yeah, where are we up to on that?
So that deal ran out. The original deal, which was about discounted 50, has in fact expired, but they've moved to new wholesale pricing, which meant that for most customers, the plans haven't changed. Yeah. We saw a big change when those 50 plans came in. That was at the beginning of this year. We've actually now seen that end, but the overall wholesale structure has stayed the same. So we've seen very little change in the plans that are out there. Fundamentally, the plans you can get now are the same as the plans you could get 3 to 4 months ago. And there's no real reason to expect that we're going to see I don't think we'll see another step change in the way that pricing works. I think we've now locked mostly where we're at.
That's the consumer-facing side of it, though. If you're an ISP, to my understanding, you had the choice to change constructs and mix around and so on. But ultimately, for the consumer, it's the price that you see for the speed that you want.
We're not, and I don't think we're going to see so many shifts there. We are about to see, we were referring earlier to sort of the grandparental plan for the person who just wants to not lose their line. We've got the new version of that, which is the one that literally doesn't even give you 12. It's just designed to give you a voice line and the ability to browse your emails. I've not seen what it's interesting. We haven't seen a lot of people roll out that plan. There's always this theory that there's this political lip service paid to you must deal with the customer who doesn't want this. We've not seen any activity in terms of loads of people going, right, yeah, I want to get the grandma plan out the door. I've been really low priority for ISPs, which suggests to me that they don't actually think there's a demand for it and that was just a political sop so that NBN Co could say it was doing the right thing.
Although at the big end of town, they have also announced gigabit plans for businesses. But that's on a case-by-case rollout basis, and you've got to have a serious chunk of change to actually afford one of those.
I reckon we'll still see more of those before we see too many people signing up for the dumb cheapskate plan. And to be clear, don't sign up for that plan. It's a terrible plan. You'd literally be better off on 4G at that point.
So, Gus, Vodafone have improved their roaming deals again. Now, for like I was saying, back when one wore an onion on their belt, roaming fees could just kill you. It was insane. And they've improved a lot in the last few years, but there's still work to be done. What do we think of these new deals from Vodafone?
Well, it's a good improvement. Vodafone already had, I think, what was certainly one of the simplest and most straightforward deals, which is, okay, pay us $5 a day and whatever's on your plan, you just get to keep using. So for a consumer, that seems really easy. It already covered, I have to say, most places Australians were likely to travel to were already on that list. And so now we've seen expansion to 11 countries. There are a couple of big notable ones in there, probably. The big three, the places that you might go to would be South Korea, Russia, Mexico. Those are the places that people have heard about. There are other places on this list that are so tiny. Like you've now got roaming in Liechtenstein. If you couldn't get a roaming signal in Liechtenstein, if you walk 3 steps to the left, you'll be in another country. And then I think you'd have been all right. So I don't know that that's going to matter quite as much. At the firm end of the list of countries that right now I think you'd be mad to want to travel to, we have Saudi Arabia. That's just
people do business in Saudi Arabia. It happens. Although I should point out, the $5 deal is postpaid Vodafone only, not prepaid.
Exactly. So they want you in for the contract. That's their seller. So this, it's still good that there are more countries there because on most roaming plans, it is a little bit. Once you get outside the obvious top 10 destinations, you've got to go. What are your options? So it's a good improvement, but it sounds easy. You start saying, "Well, this is good," but then you work it out. You go away for 2 weeks. That's still looking at like an additional 140 odd that you've your cost goes up. That's terrible maths. It was 70. It wasn't 140. $5 by 14 days. But still, if you're going to one country, chances are you could buy a local SIM for less than that and not have to worry about it.
But it's the hassle of not having to. You don't have to go through the hassle of buying a local SIM and swapping it over. And if you've got an iPhone, it can take 24 hours for bloody iMessages to catch up with the fact that you've changed the SIM and then you put it back.
Yeah.
So there comes a point where you just say, just shut up and take my money and make the problem go away.
It's the best. It is the best of the lazy tax versions. It's certainly, it's better than the deals you'll get out of Telstra and Optus. And Telstra and Optus' deals are much better, as you alluded to at the start. They're much better than they used to be. Vodafone's is the best of them. But it works best if you're kind of shifting around countries a lot. And if you're doing a really short trip, if you're doing a couple of days, you're probably not going to do better out of a local SIM provider. And it's going to be, significantly less convenient, especially if there are language barriers or the like. But any kind of longer travel, it's much harder to justify it beyond that, hey, it's kind of convenient thing.
Yeah, and return is like, if you're going to do business in Saudi Arabia, you're expensing this. You don't care about it
That's
so much.
True.
If you're a travel, but I think the other thing that I've really noticed, and even anecdotally as I talk to people, is convenience is a big reason. The second reason people used to worry about wanting to use roaming rather than switching SIM is, I don't want to have to change my number. I want to be able to stay on my number. But that no longer really matters because if you're living in the universe where you're using a WhatsApp or a Viber, you keep getting the messages that will go to that number anyway. Like that particular point of friction has really disappeared. And I think for some people, it's got to the point of, it's not about whether I have to get a local SIM. It's like, can I leech enough Wi-Fi at my hotel and on the street to not bother having a SIM at all?
There are some security implications with that, though. And again, I suppose for the business travellers, again, they're expensing it. But for other people, you shouldn't do your internet banking off that dodgy roadside cafe Wi-Fi.
There are massive security implications, but I'll venture to suggest that many of the people who are going to holiday in many of our fine neighbouring holiday countries do not have those at top of mind when they're making these decisions.
There is another...
that's probably fair.
There is another advantage to roaming, and I'm not sure exactly which countries it applies in and which telcos, but I know, for example, with Telstra, if you go to China and roam with Telstra, when you use your phone thinks you're in Australia. So you can access all those things that the Chinese might not want you looking at. Whereas if you got some kind of local SIM, I don't even know if they would sell you one there, but if they did, you ain't going to be able to get into those sort of things. So would be times, I don't know if they do that in all countries or just countries like China where there are problems accessing things. But sometimes that's the advantage there, is knowing that the phone will actually work the way you want it to.
My own experience, and this so often falls to being broadly anecdotal, and we know that's quite dangerous, but my own experience is the Chinese firewall is so weird. It's so inconsistent. I've stayed in hotels where you've been able to say, yeah, look, I can access Google services from here. You walk out into the street, you're on something else. No, suddenly they're completely blocked. So I wouldn't rely on that to speak of. And I suppose we've also got to be careful to say that there are some things like that, like, for example, Telstra's sports streaming stuff, which you get free if you're a Telstra postpaid customer and on some of the prepaid plans as well. That stuff doesn't work outside of Australia unless you actually VPN back into Australia, unless you make it think you're there. And frankly, if you're traveling somewhere like China, I'd be taking a VPN.
Anyway. Yeah. Several.
Yeah.
I'd have one
you want to defend yourselves. And we'll have a visual of that on available on the Twitter accounts and various other places very soon.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's, and you were making this point earlier, Gus, that it's a bit less relevant because of free Wi-Fi and the different ways that we communicate. I guess it's also for some people expanding this is problematic in that it lessens the number of places where you can actually get away from it all.
Well, it does, but I think if you're going for the general get away from it all experience, one thing you do have to remember is that network coverage still varies hugely. If you take yourself to most smaller kind of beachside resorts and stuff, you'll rapidly find that your signal is disappearing and dwindling to nothing. And at the end of the day, show some discipline, people. Just put flight mode on.
You just pull the old trick. I'm going through the tunnel. I can't hear you. You're breaking up.
Yeah, that works. And actually, your point about
piece of paper makes for a very handy prop in that situation.
It is quite true in that one of those things that I think anyone who travels overseas experiences this outside of maybe Singapore, sometimes bits of South Korea, but not much, that we get actually, especially for metropolitan users, less so for regional, we get very spoiled in Australia. We've actually got very robust, very fast mobile networks. And you go places where you think, oh yeah, reasonably developed place, and you suddenly realize, wow, I'm on a 3G signal, and it's a really bad 3G signal.
That'd be the centre of Melbourne some days.
Well, it would indeed. But I'm very conscious, particularly when I go to the States, of how often, if I do roam, what I've done as a roaming trip, how often I roam when I'm there, in that it doesn't stay on the same network tower for any amount of time at all. Like, literally, well, half a block, and I'll switch from one service to the other, and it makes for a very unpredictable experience sometimes. The
US market is terrible. I mean, the advertising you see for the US mobile market talks about, coverage, and they put up these maps, and it's like, but there's these half dozen states that you don't cover at all. You're just not there. It's akin to, was it Virgin who were almost never in Tasmania and Northern Territory back in the day when Virgin Mobile were a thing?
And famously way back when 3 launched, it was very, very limited. So, it took a while. Tasmania remains a kind of bit of an isolated experience for many people, as does most of the NT. So yeah, it happens. But yeah, at the point when, yes, you say you've got entire states missing, let's be clear, there's probably at least 4 US states that no one should go to, but for the sake of not offending those listeners, I won't name them. But yeah, you know where you are.
Possibly. So in terms, because Gus, I know you travel a lot, in terms of roaming tips for people, I mean, outside of my immediate thought is that an awful lot of, especially if you're buying a phone outright, an awful lot of them are dual SIM. So the issue with kind of roaming and data is not so much of a thing. You switch your phone over to non-data roaming, and even if you are paying the going rate, it's not hideously brutal if you keep your phone calls under control and if you use WhatsApp or Viber or what have you, and then you use a local data SIM or whatever. That's the way I'd approach it. How would you approach it? What kind of tips would you give?
It's exactly the same now as it is when you're picking a phone plan in Australia. Forget what the calls say. Who's making calls? When is this happening? You seriously want to look at the chunk of data you've got, I think this is where people go wrong, in that a lot of these SIMs, and this is the biggest problem to me in if you buy a SIM in advance, one of those multi-country SIMs, is that their data allowance is often quite measly. And the reality is that you go through a lot of data when you're on holidays. People do this because everyone's getting on the socials and everyone's sharing their photos, and you see people's stuff disappear that way. So I go back to saying, whatever option you're using, make sure that your data is appropriate, and that's going to work. It's much more important than what the call inclusions are. That's not really going to get in your way.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks again to Angus for joining us for the show.
Ba-ting!
And as always, we love to get your feedback on the show, so feel free to comment via Twitter or the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
Thanks everyone for listening. And remember, if you like what you hear, hit that subscribe button. Tell your friends, get them to hit the subscribe button. Leave us a review. Help spread the word. Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, is proudly brought to you by Belkin.
Does the NBN really have a clean bill of... There's the end credits, if nothing else. Does the NBN really have a clean bill of... Fudge.